Hello, my name is Dave. I'm here to guide you through some of the questions for the Arizona Educator Proficiency Assessment exams. I'm just going to get started, jump into question number one. Question number one is about a high school graduate who gets a summer job, and she has a regularly scheduled number of hours that she doesn't actually hit every week. They describe it by saying that in the third week she works 20% more hours than she did in the second week. And in the second week, she works 30% more hours than she did in the first week. In the first week, she works 10% fewer hours than is her regularly scheduled hours. And they ask us questions and find her regularly scheduled hours. And you'll notice in this question that if you look down toward the bottom, what they ask you to find, the regularly scheduled hours, usually in these, that's what you're going to pick for your variable, the thing that they actually ask you to find. So I'm going to write down up here that H is her regularly scheduled hours. I'm going to do that because everything is defined in terms of that. The information they gave you, and they said that she works 20% more hours in week 3 than she did in week 2. 20% or 20% more hours means that she's working 100% of the hours plus 20% more, which is 120%, as many hours in week 3 as she worked in week 2. Math isn't necessarily done with percentages. Percentages are just ways of writing fractions. Per means divide in math, cent is 100. So that percent could be written this way, per cent, which means that the proportion for it is 1.20. So if we take her number of hours in the second week, and we multiply that by 1.20, we should get back the number of hours that she worked in the third week. That's the 20% more. You always want to base things upon 100% for your initial value, right? For your base quantity. So she worked 100% as many hours. 20% more means 1.20 gets multiplied by the hours that she worked in the second week, and that's the hours that she worked in the third week. So I'm going to condense that a little bit. And we're going to define everything in terms of the hours that she worked in the previous week. Like they tell us that she works 30% more hours in week 2 than she does in week 1. So we're going to have the number of hours worked in week 2 is, in these courses, is an equal sign. When you take the verbal statements, you want to be able to convert those into math expressions. Look for words like is, was, should be, used to be, those type things. Those are always equal signs. So number of hours worked in the second week is 30% more, which means 130% as much as. There's your 130% as much as the hours worked in the first week. And then it tells you as well that she worked 10% fewer hours the first week than she was scheduled to work. 10% fewer would mean her regularly scheduled hours subtracting 10% means that she's working 90% as many hours in the first week as she was scheduled to work. So if we do that, we have this for the information they gave us. All the equal signs of the word is, hours in the third week, 120% as many or 20% more hours than she worked in the second week, etc. 30% more hours in the second week than in the first week, 90% as many hours, which is 10% fewer hours in week 1 than she was scheduled to work. They also give us that she worked 46 hours total in the third week. So we have that for our expression. This is an example of what's called a recursive sequence, by the way. When they give you sequence and series, when you define things in terms of what happened previously, they call that recursive. That's kind of what they did for every one of these. We don't have a constant ratio between them. We go from 0.9 to 1.3 to 1.2, but those are recursive. We define them in terms of what came right before. So anyway, if we start doing these, we can solve these. We have a value for week 3, right? If I just take this H3, equals 1.20 times the number of hours worked in week 2. I can replace the H2 with 1.30 H1. So I'm going to take this and rewrite this. Number of hours worked in week 2 was 1.30 times the number of hours worked in week 1. And then I can repeat the process called substitution. I'm going to substitute in for the H1. I'm going to plug in the 0.90H because we are solving this for H, which is our regularly scheduled hours. And if I grab my calculator and actually multiply those out as I did previously, those are 1.404 times H. They told us that she worked 46 hours in her 3rd week, so this becomes a 46. I'm just going to get rid of it here because I'm running out of board space. If we divide the 1.404 over here, we get that, and because I did it earlier, that is 32.76. And that is how many hours she was scheduled to work. 32.76 rounds to 33, which I believe was answer B, and that's what it is. So that was question number 1 in your assessment test.